everyone, and welcome to the National Complete Streets Coalition's webinar series, Complete Streets 301, Putting People First. Today, we are excited to be presenting on protecting user data and expanding mobility for all communities. I'm Emily Schwiniger with the National Complete Streets Coalition, a program of Smart Growth America. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan alliance of public interest organizations and transportation professionals committed to the development and implementation of complete streets, policies, and practices. A nationwide movement launched by the coalition in 2004, Complete Streets is the integration of people and place in the planning, design, construction, operation, and maintenance of transportation networks. You can join the coalition and our special guests each month for a new topic related to creating streets and places that put people first. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, co-hosted by Smart Growth America, the National Complete Streets Coalition, and Lyft. Today, we'll be running through the agenda around protecting user data and expanding mobility for all communities. We're going to start with Caroline Sampanero at Lyft, move on to Lee Rainey at Pew Research Center, then we'll hear from Annie Chang with the SAE International, and close out with our presenters with Molly Pilon McArdle with SharedStreets. Then we'll have a portion for questions and answers, so please pay attention to the bottom left chat box where you can be putting your questions into that, send them over to us, and we will get to those questions at the end of everyone's presentation. And with that, I would like to introduce Caroline Sampanero, who is the head of Micromobility policy at Lyft. Caroline joined Lyft in 2018 to start the company's new bike, scooter, and pedestrian policy program. In this new role, Caroline leads efforts to form strong partnerships with cities on policy initiatives like Vision Zero and Complete Street redesigns, as well as helps realize specific goals around bike and scooter shared mobility. Prior to Lyft, Caroline spent 2 months at OFO, and prior to that, 12 years as Deputy Director of Transportation Alternatives in New York City. At Transportation Alternatives, Caroline led the advocacy campaigns to bring Vision Zero to the United States, established the country's largest bike share program, City Bike, and set national standards for urban complete streets design. Caroline.
Thanks, Emily. Hey everyone, so happy to be your host today and proud to be sponsoring this important webinar with our partners at the National Complete Streets Coalition and of course Smart Growth America. As Emily noted, before I joined Lyft, I spent the majority of my career as an advocate focused on ways we can better build streets for people, not cars. Very pertinent to this conversation today about how we share data as we share more rides in our cities, whether it's four wheels or two. One of the sort of formative experiences I had as an advocate was during the time when we were pushing our government agencies in New York City in particular to share traffic crash data on a monthly and annual basis so that the public could better understand the problem of traffic violence. Before we made that push and before the government started sharing that data monthly, it often took more than a year for crash data to surface, which of course kept the public and the government from working together to help solve this problem. It was because of that data, but more importantly because of the political activism of traffic violence victims that I helped organize, you may have heard of them, Families for Safe Streets, that led elected leaders to make Vision Zero a real and clear policy commitment. I've personally watched with great sadness over the last few years as we've seen some of this urgency slip away, and traffic crashes have started to rise again. This is happening even though we have Vision Zero policy and even though we have the data to justify slower speed limits in every city and the radical transformation of public space to give more street space to people and less space to cars. So as we're thinking about data standards and the ways we share that data between the public and private sector, it's really important that we reflect on where we've succeeded and where we continue to fall short. It's important that as partners in this discussion, we're thinking about how we protect user privacy and civil liberties, even as we turn over a great deal of new information about people who are doing things like riding shared scooters or bikes for the very first time. I think as transportation professionals, it's also really important we push back on a tendency to mythologize data and to think that it alone can solve problems. We already have a lot of the data we need to justify the big changes I think this coalition is hoping to achieve together. And that's why we're so proud to be a part of the National Complete Streets Coalition. Through our bike and scooter shared programs, Lyft is trying to solve some really big problems in partnership with governments. At a very high level, we're looking to reduce car ownership and get cars off the road. We're looking to make sure that our transportation systems are more equitable, more accessible, and more easy to use. On equity, in every city where we operate shared bikes and scooters, we offer a reduced fare membership program in the hopes that we can connect the dots between existing affordable transit options and this new micromobility opportunity. When it comes to safe streets, we're also fully committed to making Vision Zero the reality that we know it can be. We are doing that by using our technology capacity to not only share data with cities about where people are choosing to ride, but also engaging directly with our passengers, drivers, and riders with things like the Dutch Reach Safety campaign that you may have seen recently released, and also through partnerships with cities to set up designated pickup and drop-off locations that pull our drivers off of painted bike lanes as we push cities to protect those bike lanes. And so on data sharing, we care deeply about, first of all, empowering our city partners to have the data they need to do great planning to build streets for people. And we're also thinking a lot about user privacy and how we can make sure that those two things are not at odds. On a daily basis, we're sharing de-identified data with a number of regulators to make sure that the cities have the information they need to do good transportation planning. That said, we have growing concerns about the trend in some of these requirements that do put privacy at risk. More specifically, the emerging mobility data specification standard calls for an unprecedented amount of real-time tracking information if implemented to its fullest potential. So while we want this data sharing to have a tangible impact, we're also wanting to make sure that we can keep this conversation active and healthy as we push ourselves to have the best possible standards. So as far as NDS is concerned, I think you all know this, but our server is pinged every 5 seconds, and we're giving basically the breadcrumb data of our scooter and bike share riders to our regulators. So we wait to turn over that trip level data until after the ride ends. That's on the MDS provider side. On the MDS agency side, actually the spec calls for real-time, every 5-second trip level data. We've worked in partnership with a lot of our city partners in LA in particular to come up with an arrangement where we can delay the turnover of that trip level data by 24 hours to make sure that we're protecting our riders' privacies. But that's obviously not a sustainable solution if we're talking about a data standard. While a lot of large cities have the budget and the infrastructure to manage this amount of data, there are a lot of other cities who have voiced concerns about how to do this the right way. And so this is a great forum to discuss that. There are bigger questions about, for example, what happens when you get a FOIA request for this type of data? Or what do you do if the police comes knocking and wants access to the data too? We feel strongly that for a standard to work, it has to do as well in a sanctuary city as it does in a border town state. And we feel like we still have work to do on this front. So with that, we're lucky today to be joined by experts in this field, folks that are thinking every day about how to tie together this goal of great planning and user safety and civil liberties. And we're really, really happy to be at the center of this conversation in so many cities across the U.S. And with that, Emily, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for all of that. Really interesting to see the work that Lyft is doing, and clearly on the front lines of this question around data protection and mobility use. So with that, I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Lee Rainey. Lee Rainey is the Director of Internet and Technology Research at the Pew Research Center, a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that studies the social impact of the Internet. His project was described by the American Sociological Association as the most authoritative source of reliable data on the use and impact of the Internet and mobile connectivity. And the ASA awarded him and the Internet Project its award for Excellence in the Reporting on Social Issues Award. Lee.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm delighted to be here and part of this conversation. And it's so fascinating to hear how the transportation community is now, thinking about the same kind of issues that are very much on Americans' minds as they come to understand privacy in completely different ways, particularly in the recent years that we've been studying at the Pew Research Center after the Snowden revelations, after the wave of data breaches that have occurred at commercial and nonprofit enterprises and government enterprises, and also after the Cambridge Analytica story, which sort of heightened public concerns about this. So these are nationally representative data. We surveyed adults in the United States, and this is how the country is thinking about and mostly confused about and concerned about the state of privacy overall in their lives. So we broke our questionnaire into separate parts, asking questions related to companies and data sharing and data surveillance and monitoring practices, and then government similar situations. But interestingly, we found that, a lot of Americans don't think that it is possible to go through daily life without data being collected on them. In other words, they're thinking that living in public is the modern condition. In many cases, you have to buy your way out of that level of surveillance, and it's only really available to people who can afford to buy their way out of it. We asked about the practices that they feel that they are encountering when they are going through life. And 72% said that they think companies are surveilling them most or all or most of the time, and another 19% said that about company surveillance some of the time. And in government, they're also thinking that it's a pretty common practice. 47% said it was occurring almost all of the time. 30% said at least some of the time online. And then we compared that, of course, with public readings about offline surveillance. So many people now are thinking that when they're living their life in digital spaces, they are much more likely to be surveilled than they are offline. But it's still sort of the broad condition is that you're being watched and being chronicled and your data are being collected a lot of different ways. So we asked how they feel about this, and you'll see here that a lot of people say they feel a lack of control. They feel very little or no control over the data that either companies or the government collects about them. They're particularly worried about the sort of cost-benefit ratio of data collection. So 81% of people think the potential risks of data collection about them outweigh the benefits, which is a striking sense that there's not necessarily a payoff to them personally for this data collection. And two-thirds of Americans think that about the government data collection about them. 79% say that they are concerned about how data are used, and 59% say that they don't understand how companies are using the data, and 3/4 of Americans say they don't understand how government is collecting data about them. So this sort of broad, pervasive sense that this is a system that is operating in ways they can't comprehend, they can't intervene in, and they don't have much control over, and they're kind of worried about the way that they are profiled and the way those profiles affect what they are experiencing in life, and maybe even ways they are being directed in life. Again, this is the broad picture that we are looking at when we ask the risks-benefits question, which is, in a way, we ask this very broad question. You'll see later on in some of my slides that there are particular circumstances where people think that there are benefits. So it's not necessarily an entirely black and white picture where it's either all or nothing. There are specific contexts in which people think data sharing and data collection and surveillance matters and can be useful to them. But as a broad proposition, they think the whole sort of ecosystem of data collection is not necessarily giving them as many benefits as it is providing risks. But then we sort of ask questions about, your side of the bargain. Lots of companies are fully in compliance, and the government is pretty transparent about what's being collected and how it's being collected. And in the case of companies, getting permission about having it collected. And only 22% of Americans say they almost entirely read the privacy policies they encounter before signing off on them. And a lot of them don't even think that it's worth reading all the way through them. You can see that 36% of Americans never read the policies that they encounter, and only 43% say that they glance over it. So there are ways in which, the transparency, the disclosure and notice system isn't necessarily producing results that are useful to folks. And this is one of those contexts where different kinds of data collection matter to people. So we asked if it was acceptable or not acceptable for data to be collected in these series of circumstances. if you'll see, a plurality are sort of okay with the idea that poorly performing schools can share student data with a nonprofit seeking to improve school outcomes. That's the top of that list. Again, a plurality are okay with government collecting data about Americans to assess potential terrorist crimes or threats. And then at the very bottom there, you'll see that this position flips, that a plurality don't like the idea of smart speaker makers sharing users' audio dip recordings with law enforcement to help with criminal investigation. So there's a very conditional, context-specific kind of way that Americans are thinking about data collection. They are not comfortable with how companies use their data, and they're not comfortable with the idea that companies would be good stewards of their data, and the material on this slide is illustrative of that. And this side, too, sort of makes the case that even as Americans kind of are aware that the data are being collected, they're not sure that companies will be held accountable, that they perform in good ways that consumers would like. So there's a real trust question that's at the core of many Americans' thinkings now about data collection. And they think, just as a general rule, very open-ended, very broad question, there should be more government regulation. It's true of both Republicans and Democrats, but Democrats in particular are warm to that thought. But then we asked a sort of final sort of summary question about, okay, you say the government should do stuff. Well, whose shoulders is this mostly on? And 55% say that they think that better tools for allowing individual people to control their personal information would be a more effective way to solve some of the concerns that they have with privacy. 44% said rather than that, stronger laws themselves would be the best way to be thinking about them. And so with that sort of very broad overview of our findings related to Americans and data, I'm going to hand it back to Emily.
Thank you so much, Lee. Very interesting and great to have data on this, these thoughts around data. We are, just a reminder, we will have our question and answer session at the end of all of the presentations. So please continue to ask questions in the bottom left-hand corner. You'll see the chat box. And with that, I'd like to move to our next presenter. We will be hearing from Annie Chang, who is the head of New Mobility and director of the Mobility Data Collaborative at SAE, where she oversees the standards and research portfolio on shared and micromobility. Prior to SAE, Annie led research on new mobility and road safety at ITS America and the World Resources Institute. Annie is currently pursuing a PhD in civil engineering at McGill University with a focus on micromobility. Annie?
Thank you so much. So here we go. So I'm going to be talking about the Mobility Data Collaborative, which is a consortium of various stakeholders in the mobility data sharing space. So I'd like to start with kind of a reflection of my 3 years at SAE, where I've had the pleasure of collaborating directly with leaders in the new mobility community. The core of my job has always been consensus building among different stakeholders to establish technical solutions to really advance new mobility technologies and their deployment. Some of this work has taken form in standards committees, which is our traditional route at SAE, and in industry research. One of our newer initiatives is the Mobility Data Collaborative, where consensus building is taking place in the form of a consortium. So I'm happy to share that after months of ironing out the details of scope and governance structure, we have finally launched the Mobility Data Collaborative at the end of last year. The members of the collaborative share this vision of really leveraging mobility data to promote space for more equitable and livable streets for all. The collaborative's mission is to bring key stakeholders together to develop a framework, a unified framework for data sharing for public benefit while protecting consumer privacy. So the collaborative's work and governance structure is guided by 6 principles. We foster inclusivity and equality. All the members have an equal voice in the development of our technical work. We embrace collaboration. We believe that cross-sector collaboration is the right way to move forward with such complex and sensitive issues like data sharing. We complement and not duplicate. And, we do recognize that there are other initiatives that are also doing very good work, and we would like to complement them instead of wasting our efforts on coming up with duplicative measures. We support wide adoption. We like to build very scalable tools. We act with a sense of urgency. We are expediting many of the best practice developments. And lastly, we continue to challenge ourselves. Are we doing things correctly? Are we looking at it through the right lens? So our approach is, as I mentioned, to provide tools that really allow everyone involved to reap the benefits of this highly valuable mobility data. And the way we're doing so is to create practice-ready tools that can be scaled internationally and potentially across different shared travel modes. This is a picture of our current partners, and we're currently onboarding more. And I just want to highlight that it is definitely a collaborative forum that brings together multiple sectors. We have public agencies, academia, nonprofits, operators, as well as data platforms. So what are we really working on? We are working on two projects at this time. The first one is around performance metrics. As you may be familiar with this topic, metrics are used to reward or penalize operators. And these metrics can include things like, how many trips per vehicle per day on average. And although it seems like such a simple question or metric to be answered, we have seen enormous inconsistency in defining and interpreting such metrics. So we are building a standardized glossary and set of methodologies for such metrics so that we can finally compare apples to apples across operators and across regions. So to revisit the example of, say, the number of trips per vehicle per day, in order for that metric to be used effectively, we really need to get consensus on what we're counting as a trip, right? So if a trip is 2 seconds long, and technically it's a false start, is that a trip? If one operator counts that as a trip and another doesn't, then we're not able to get to the level playing field of comparing apples to apples. The second project that we're working on is around data privacy. We have come to learn that there is a general lack of understanding on foundational issues around data privacy across sectors. And often we see one-off custom-built data sharing agreements which do not adequately address privacy measures. So we are developing a set of guidelines to establish privacy-minded foundations for data governance. We're focusing on how to align interests between the different sectors and how to ensure mutual understanding between all the parties involved. For example, we will tackle things like how to manage expectations around open records requests. The guideline to data privacy is phase 1. We are also looking towards phase 2, which may include standardized data governance as well as legal language to support each of the governance models, whether that's the trip data is aggregated before being shared, or the raw trip data is being shared, or there is a third party that sits between the operators and the phase. Our next steps include the publication of our first set of best practices. So those are the metrics and the data privacy piece. We plan to launch them during the Shared Mobility Summit, which will occur, I believe, March 17th to 19th. We have a session there. And in the meantime, we will continue to explore other issues that need immediate attention. And will likely continue on a phase 2 of metrics. As I believe Caroline mentioned earlier, something like safety is something that requires standardized metrics for reporting. So that's something that we are keen to work on in the near future. And with that, I want to reiterate that we're all ears, and we'd like to get your feedback, and we would love to expand our collaborative. So here's my contact information, and thank you so much. Emily?
Thank you so much, Annie. Very interesting. And we're moving on to our next presenter. We will be hearing from Molly Pilon-McCardle, with the co-director at SharedStreets. She is the co-director and co-founder of SharedStreets, a nonprofit that builds open source software and standards to support new ways of sharing data that keep cities moving. Molly focuses on how SharedStreets tool can impact smarter transportation and technology policies in cities and support SharedStreet efforts on data privacy. Molly?
Thanks, Emily. As Emily said, I'm Molly with SharedStreets, and I'm going to talk to you today about building privacy-sensitive transportation infrastructure. SharedStreets is a nonprofit, and we build open source software and digital infrastructure for cities and private companies to share transportation data. And what we found over the last couple of years is that there are no silver bullet solutions to how we manage transportation data exchange. So open source tools are the way we can explore really important questions. So here are a few of our areas of work in the last couple of years since we launched. All of our areas of work start with our open shared referencing system for the street, and then they use data standards to produce and consume information. In some cases, this means using existing standards, and in others, it means creating new standards with industry and city partners. From there, we have open basic visualization tools, and we make sure that anyone can download that information and use it in an exported way in GIS. So first, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the SharedStreets referencing system, and then I'm going to go into two of our pilot programs that specifically focus on privacy-sensitive data. And so at its core, SharedStreets is a shared language for the street, and what that means is that we despite all of the investments in maps, we lack a shared language to describe what's actually happening on our streets. And what happens when we create a shared language, it lets us create shared understanding about pretty specific things that are happening on our streets. So what you see here is what any data analyst or GIS person on this call sees most days when they try to compare two sets of information. One is the map that they have of one thing. The other is the map that they have of the other thing. In this case, we decided to pick street data and vehicle speeds. And what SharedStreets does is attach references to that information to allow you to share it across street networks, whether that means within your different city departments or across private and public company boundaries. So through this shared understanding of the street, we start to be able to unlock the collaboration and understanding that you see here. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to focus on two of our larger collaborative projects that are specifically designed to minimize privacy issues. The first is the TNC pickup and drop-off information. The second is mobility metrics, which deals with micromobility information like scooters and bikes. So the first thing that we focus on when we're designing a product that works with data that has potential touch points on personally identifiable information is how can we minimize the amount of information that the company needs to give or the end user needs to receive in order to make sure there's insight for the end user. And so we focus on solutions that allow for the best of both options and provide privacy, safety at high resolution. So the first example is our pilot project for pickup and drop-off analysis. This project was built to enable TNCs and taxi companies to share aggregated data about pickup and drop-off activity in 10-meter bins, so at fairly high resolution. This aggregates information into these bins, allowing for the city to see the information about pickup and drop-off without revealing personally identifiable information or individual trip level information. So this, we've seen, has allowed cities to ask pretty detailed questions about their streets. The example that I'm going to show you is with the city of Toronto. We're currently working with Uber and Lyft in 12 different cities to make sure that cities can get this pickup drop-off information. So in Toronto, they took the pickup drop-off information, as you see in the middle, and they combined it with multiple different existing data sets, bike lanes, traffic bylaws, and subway delays to see how pickup and drop-off responds to those different things. This is a map that the city of Toronto created to show the pickup drop-off activity near bike facilities and to inform their planning of different usage of the streets that are high capacity bike routes and also high traffic for TNCs or Transportation Network Company. I can see the question in the corner of the screen. And the next pilot project that I'm going to talk about is one that's related to micromobility data. So something that both Caroline and Annie touched on was the mobility data specification. And so this project works with MDS, the mobility data specification, to create aggregated insights. In keeping with SharedStreets values, it's open source, fully customizable, and helps limit privacy risks by working with data in aggregate. The software is installed locally, so SharedStreets never accesses personally identifiable information, and it has a programmed minimum trip threshold that basically exists to help mitigate privacy risks on the user end by aggregating the individual trip data that is revealed through MDS endpoints. For this project, the minimum threshold is 3 unique trip pairs, and so if a zone or a street doesn't show that number of trips, it kind of falls off the map unless you zoom out your spatial aggregation or out in time. And it produces reusable metrics like availability, utilization, and volume that we created by working with other cities who were very interested in those metrics. So this is a little bit of kind of what it looks like. The far left is raw MDS data, which is point or line data. The tool converts that into different metrics, either by zone, which are the hexagons you see, or the streets, which are the lines. And you can then aggregate those to custom areas. In this, you see Detroit City Council districts, or link them, like you saw in the first example with pickup drop-off data, to the city GIS network, like bike lanes. So something that we think a lot about is maintaining privacy and the balance between these 3 factors, so land use, trip volume, and time. In some cases, land use is really single-family homes or at a super granular resolution. And in that case, you kind of have to zoom out on the other factors, right? So if you zoom in pretty far on land use, you have to zoom out on time, which means having a couple of hours unless that minimum trip threshold is met. And so we have been working a lot with making sure that information on data analytics and how to get pretty detailed and granular data about your streets without compromising on privacy is out there. So this slide for the data science folks in the crowd explains a little bit more about how this process works and what ends up kind of dropping off when you turn up the resolution. Can you still maintain a pretty high volume of data? And this is actually a blog post we have up on Medium. If you want to search it, it's called Aggregating Trip Data Using K-Anonymization, and I'm happy to answer any other more detailed questions about it as well. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much. And now that we've heard from all of our presenters, and I want to thank everyone for their very valuable insight, we feel very lucky to have been able to hear from everyone today for this webinar with the National Complete Streets Coalition. We have some time for questions, as we mentioned before. If you'd still like to submit a question, make sure to type it in the chat box in the bottom left corner of your screen. But we will start to field questions now, and I think we already have received a few. One question that we have is, what is public perception regarding payment and data aggregators who collect data from multiple sources? And I want to know who would be the best person to field this question. Caroline, I know that you also have your colleague Roy Williams on the line with you. And if you'd like to say anything, but I do think that this question could be directed to Lee.
Let me take a start at it. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Lee.
Oh, okay. The public is broadly aware that there is a phenomenon that's called data aggregation and companies that are called data aggregators, and it's what bothers them because they don't know what goes on. They don't know what data sets are being collected and aggregated. They don't know how algorithms are beginning to be used to understand them. They don't know how they are showing up as algorithms make decisions about their credit score, about the content that they'll see when they're online, about any number of things. And so this is the underlying dread that people are imagining when they are thinking about the state of privacy now. And what we saw as we've pursued this issue over time, in an interesting way, the Cambridge Analytica story was the one that was the biggest wake-up call for lots of users, in the sense that in days gone by, people would think, well, the breadcrumbs, the lovely word Caroline used, the breadcrumbs that I have dropped just don't matter. You know, what I like and don't like, what I comment on is so incidental and so small scale that it couldn't possibly matter to anything. The Cambridge Analytica story showed people that even their breadcrumbs are used to understand them in pretty profound kinds of possible ways, and it was one of the sort of things that began to show up in our data as people expressing confusion about the state of play, and data aggregators are certainly now part of the ecosystem that confuses them.
Thank you so much, Lee. If any of the other presenters have anything else to add, I'll leave a little space for that, or we can move on to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is Caroline. I would just add that I think the sort of conversations that are happening among planners and companies that like we've got into today, I think are largely not very accessible to the public. And so I think one of the things that we at Lyft feel very responsible for is making sure that on their behalf we raise these larger questions, knowing that most of the time when someone hops on one of our scooters, they're not thinking twice about the level of data that we're being required to turn over. And so we really see it as our responsibility to be a steward and to both educate but also, you know, hold ourselves accountable to being that voice for them.
Great, thank you for that. I'll move on to the next question that we received. This one is, how can my agency or region become a member of Mobility Data Collaborative and obtain the best practices document and data governance guidelines? I think that we can give this question to Annie.
Yeah, so all of our best practices, when they're published, they will be publicly available on our website. So the website link, I can type it in, mobilitydatacollaborative.org. In terms of membership, we would love to have more public agencies. You're very welcome to join. If you follow up with me, I can send you some of the agreements, and we can talk through different aspects of the membership and different roles each member can play. I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. Sounds great. And then another question that has come in from Monica, do you have data for all local areas or just major cities? I think this question could be fielded by Molly.
Yeah, we work with the TNC's, transportation networking companies, and local taxi commissions to figure out kind of which cities we work with. That said, I think the smallest city that we've worked with so far is Columbus, Ohio. And then we also work with larger cities, but the kind of minimum threshold is that there's more than one provider available so that the data can be aggregated between the two providers or more.
All right, great. Moving through, we have a question here. Can opt-in clauses address data privacy concerns and empower users? What are other ways governments and companies empower users? And I'll ask Caroline if you have, and perhaps Roy, your colleague, if you have any thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I'll start and then I'll pass it to Roy because he's the expert. But I'll use the example of City Bike in New York City, where our bike fleet is actually not GPS enabled, but we're really committed to sharing good data with our city partners in New York. And so we have something called Rider Insights, where our city bike riders can opt in to sharing their trip level data with us, and then we can share that with the city. So it is that opt-in model, which we found to be really helpful and also strikes a nice balance with some of the larger issues that we've raised. Roy, do you want to add to that?
I think just as Owen Caroline said, that the opt-in is a big difference. You have to go into City Bike, into your settings page, and say you want to share this data. Users understand that that the city will be using this data to help with planning, and I think that's also a really big part of this, is that users actually understand if I give this data to the city, they will then do X with it, or the city is stating that they will do X with it, which is really useful. Versus a different model where you're kind of opted in just by using the product.
All right, thank you. Another question we just received. Do any of you ever assist in lobbying state legislatures who have implemented laws prohibiting licensing or regulations on TNCs to assist cities with advocating and educating lawmakers on the need to do so? Have you run into this roadblock often where localities cannot regulate because of state-level protections? And this is for everyone. So whoever would like to start.
This is Caroline. I'm happy to start. I think certainly we work closely with both state and city officials at Lyft to figure out the right balance on regulation. I think a notable difference between, rideshare, for example, which is often regulated at the state level, and micromobility, which is regulated at the city level, is, rideshare often is traveling longer distances between different cities and towns, sometimes even states, and so that state framework is very helpful. Of course, cities having control is also, something we understand and value, and I think the micromobility regulatory environment over the last few years has been a great example, in some ways, of how much expertise cities bring to the table when it comes to managing day-to-day transportation. So, I think, we're seeing both those dynamics.
Great. Does anyone else have anything to add? We can move to the next question. This one is for Lee. Your data shows that people are concerned. I'm sorry, that was a mistake. It's for Caroline. Your data shows that people are concerned not just about data collection by governments like MDS, but about data collection by companies like Facebook and Lyft. Lyft holds very detailed data about user behavior and shares data with law enforcement and is at risk of data breaches. How would you evaluate that risk compared to the risk posed by cities having MDS data? So for Caroline and Roy.
Cool. I'll start again and then I'll pass it to Roy, the expert. But, I think we hold ourselves to incredibly high standards. We recently have just been transitioning to compliance with the California Consumer Protection Act, which sets a new bar in protecting user privacy. I think one notable difference between data that companies have to effectively run the business and then the data that cities have, we can't be FOIA'd. A public records request can't come to us at Lyft, whereas at the city level, there are just different steps that need to be taken to make sure that data is secure and won't be turned over. And I'll just anecdotally share that in the past year, as cities and companies like us have gotten up to speed and sort of tried to make MDS work, there have been a number of different instances where FOIA requests for the trip level scooter data have come into the city and the city has not had a policy in place to handle that request. And so they've made that policy on the fly, But what's really important is that we're actively setting ourselves up before we ingest the data to have the kinds of policies in place internally to know that we're doing the right thing, and that no matter who's there answering the phone, that those standards are clear and consistent and can be upheld. Roy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, and just to build on Caroline mentioned, so we are fully compliant with CCPA now. Users can come in and request that their data, they request a copy of their data or request that their data be deleted. One of the big carve-outs for CCPA, though, is government agencies. So even if a user requests that we delete their data, we cannot then in turn ask LA or any city in California delete the data related to that user because there is this special carve-out for CCPA. And so with as other places adopt privacy rules like this, we'll be quickly able to give users this control, but we're not able to then, where there's kind of a line at the government level.
Thank you, Roy.
This is Lee on this. To the degree that we get as precise as they were just describing with how data are handled, Americans are very comfortable with that kind of regime. They understand the benefits of population level data. They appreciate efforts that companies are taking to protect or anonymize their data. And what's so interesting in our work is that location data has sort of a special place in the public imagination, because it's a place where people can most clearly say exactly what they benefit from when they know what the transportation situation is around them. And they also are sensitive, though, that they don't want everybody to know where they are at any given minute of the day. So they're deeply torn about the possibility of harm as well as the clear benefits of this kind of knowledge. And so then the protection piece and the anonymization piece is especially striking to them. And so it's just a way for me to underline the previous answer that this feels okay to Americans until some horrible breach occurs that nobody can anticipate, that is disruptive in ways that people can't articulate at the moment.
Thank you, Lee. And we have one final question today, which is how, and I believe this would be appropriate for the full panel, how can we publicize the great efforts that you are all doing so we can make users and the public more comfortable that we have their privacy front and center?
Well, Pew is not in the lobbying business, so this isn't in the form of advice either from the Pew Research Center or for Lee Rainey in particular. On a lot of these issues, it's clear that people don't know or feel they don't have a sense of what's going on. So all public education efforts probably are deeply appreciated, and particularly the work that's so thoughtful that these other organizations have gone through. Just mounting sort of basic bread and butter public education campaigns, and then inviting sort of folks in the ways that are trust building. A big problem in our broader culture is the level of distrust that people have for companies and other stewards of their data, and so conversations like this probably are necessary in the public imagination, and for many people, they would think that this would be useful.
Does anyone want to add on to that?
I mean, I think some of
Hello, this is Molly.
Go ahead, Molly. You go.
Sorry, go ahead.
You go. No, you go, Molly.
I was just going to say, the SharedStreets team is always more than happy to talk with cities about different ways that they can manage data and how they think about technology and transportation policy, especially as it changes very rapidly with detailed information. So you can reach out on Twitter, email. We're happy to have more conversations with whomever.
And Caroline, did you want to add something?
I'll make a comment and bring it back to maybe the bigger point. But I think we try to just be really direct going through the CCPA compliance updates has been, a forum and opportunity to have those kinds of conversations with our customers. And in general, I think, again, in our conversations with our city partners, we're really trying to bring that experience of the customer to them so that we can, as the private sector, think more like the public, but also help the public sector think a bit more about the challenges we're facing on the day-to-day. And I think one of the ways, like the common denominator here, which of course is the topic of the panel, is like how does this all drive back to redesigning our streets for people, not cars? How are we making sure that, as we perfect the standards and work with great and amazing tools like the ones Molly was showing us, the mobility metrics tools and others, how are we proving that all of it adds up to something better than what we've got today? In the city where I live, the leading cause of injury-related death is getting hit by a car, and I have 2 little 3-year-olds, and every time I leave the house, I'm terrified. And so we want our cities to have the tools and the justifications they need, but we can't lose sight of the fact that it's going to take the political will and the public and private coming together to maximize and optimize the political will so that we can get this done faster and with more urgency. And all this demand leads to something brighter for the future of our cities.
Thank you for that, Caroline. And I think that is a great way to wrap up our webinar in keeping our focus on why we're doing this work, focusing on the needs of people and how we're designing our streets to move people and not vehicles. So this has been a fantastic webinar. I really appreciate everyone, our panelists, being able to participate. And, we got a lot of questions. We haven't been able to answer them all. We will be publishing a follow-up blog post with answers to the questions we weren't able to cover. That and a recording, and along with the slides from the webinar, you will find those on smartgrowthamerica.org website next week. And to everyone who has joined us today, thank you. Please make sure to join in on next Thursday on March 26th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our next webinar, Policy to Practice, What Does Prioritizing Pedestrians Actually Look Like? And with that, from the whole National Complete Streets team, thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a fantastic day.